forbidden and banned, the bane of bureaucrats, exposing mainstream media's weapons of mass distraction.
Flying under the radar and dropping truth bombs on tyranny.
It's Liberty Now. Hello and welcome to Liberty Now. I'm your host, John Verd, trainer, piper, Navy diver, and Liberty lover. Welcome to the podcast for discerning minds and common sense. We'll look beyond the headlines and false narratives of the dying, corrupt legacy media, because we seek the truth and we can think for ourselves. Please be sure to hit subscribe to this show on your favorite podcast player app. And don't worry about taking notes while you listen. You can get all the links, files, and show notes for this episode at libertynow.com. And believe you me, after this episode, you're going to want to do some more reading and go check out those notes. Okay, buckle up, kids. We're going for a long drive today. I know there's so much information out there that none of us can keep up with it all. And I am truly grateful that you are even here listening at all. And I hope that you and I can get the truth out there in a world that desperately needs it. We're facing unprecedented times and a battle against a seemingly invisible enemy. But the more we expose it, the more we can mitigate and fight the tyrannical, technocratic New World Order that wants to subdue humanity. And I say that in all seriousness. Now, I normally keep these episodes to about 30 minutes or less, but splitting out this conversation today would have broken the flow and some very deep discussion about what's going on in the world. So I'm really honored to have as my guest today an author, Michael Anderson. He is a historian, author, and a political analyst focused on contemporary American politics and its problems. He applies history and the analysis of political systems from the past to understand it. So I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Without further ado, Michael Anderson, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm pretty much buried in it. So
yeah,
you can go any direction you'd like.
Yeah, awesome. And what was the title of your most recent book? I was looking at a couple of them.
Twilight of the American Experiment. Without moral balance, our republic will fall. And it basically what that book is about is the imbalance in the media, where, in all the media, between academia, traditional media, and social media, it all leans left. And so the public only hears, the majority of what they hear comes from the left. And so that has an impact on people's opinions. And if the views are misrepresented by the bias, then that's a problem.
Yeah. And boy, I've been noticing this since I've become a little more increasingly politically awake myself. I think what really started me down this rabbit hole probably 15 years ago or more, I read Thomas Malthus's essay on population. And that was kind of an eye-opener in that I don't think he was making any prescriptions per se, but his just cold analytical view on, people as just basically numbers. And, the more I read into some of these other globalist writings, I realize that he's had a big influence on them. And it seems like the elites, we'll just call them they, we can name names, Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and other people who are eugenicists. They really seem to be concerned about world population or the overpopulation of the world, which I think has a lot to do with what we're seeing today. Do you address that in your books?
That's interesting you brought that up, because my first 4 books have been basically about left-right conflicts. One was about the genetic influences that make the left what they are, and another one was about the right. And I wrote a book called Tribalism in 2019, and then the 4th book, which I gave you the title of. So I've been immersed in trying to figure out how to fix tribalism and get people to understand why the left and right are different. It's basically behavioral and biological. It's genetic. They have different brains. And so because they have different brains, they think differently. So the whole idea of you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong is absurd because the other side thinks differently. So,
Right.
and I use the United States as an example. The country to move forward has to move forward by consensus. It can't move forward by domination of one side or the other, because
Absolutely.
each side in the extreme has views that are impractical and very biased. So that's why we need consensus. But what I'm getting to is my fifth book, which we may end up talking more about.
Uh-huh.
Comes out in September. It's called America's Counterfeit Democracy.
Huh.
Basically, the theme of the book is that wealthy families and large international corporations run our country, not the people.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so, I mean, that kind of gets into the globalism thing. Probably know what neoliberalism is. Basically, it's
Yeah.
the view that uh, capitalism is sacred and everything in human society should be driven toward the efficient capitalism. And if it leaves people out, so what? Because capitalism is king. And then globalism, of course, is an extension of that. Most of the large corporations in America are global and have manufacturing and sales across the globe. So they try to exert their influence across the globe. And you could say that there's my term is power elite. That's the
Right.
combination of the wealthy families and corporations. That term comes from a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, who wrote a book in 1956 called The Power Elite, where
Ah,
he first described it. And
I'll write down that title and we'll share that with our listeners. The Power Elite.
yeah,
And who's the author?
C. Wright Mills, letter C, period, Wright, Wright, Mills, Mills.
Sounds like good reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carry on.
Pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay.
You're,
So, but the power elite has extended itself obviously beyond any particular nation state to globalist worldview. And I think my
Mhm.
sixth book is actually going to be about neoliberalism and globalism, because there are so many problems that presents, that I feel like I have to write about it. You
Yeah.
probably read, I mean, the sort of the authoritarian direction that Europe has taken, which I think is amazing. I mean, this whole thing about farmers have to get rid of 1/3 of their land or 1/3 of their animals if they raise animals because they're causing pollution. So it's
Right.
like this big brother population ideology that the danger to me is it subverts nation state and it subverts the
Oh,
individual. Um,
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
the issue with nation state is because the globalists are not accountable to anybody.
Right. Well,
Once you
it's
once you
the
extend
exactly.
laws, go beyond the laws of the nation, you have no laws, basically.
Yeah, and I start to sound like I'm against free market capitalism or capitalism in general when I start thinking or talking this direction that the corporations are unaccountable
Yeah,
because I mean that's the nature of a corporation, corp or body, right?
yeah,
That has all the rights and freedoms of an individual person without the accountability or liability. So they separate themselves from any liability, well, limited liability corporations, as an
right.
example,
Yeah,
which can protect the owners, from undue burden of excessive lawsuits. I get all that, but at this level, they end up uh, only beholden to shareholders and profits, and people or citizens' health or anything else be damned.
right.
And where I think it gets into the real muddy waters, or the problem area, is when corporations can use their money to lobby and influence governments, and then use the bully force of a government to push their corporate profit driven agenda. perfect example is in the most recent COVID pandemic. I call it a pandemic. I think it's provable that it was intended and planned. But all that aside, there's no doubt that the pharmaceutical giants profited and used their influence through government agencies to suppress non-pharmaceutical remedies that were
Yes.
cheap and readily available,
No doubt.
and also to remove themselves from the liability of the damages that their solution caused in the form of the COVID injection. I'm not going to dignify it by calling it a vaccine because it's an experimental mRNA concoction. But yeah, that, I mean, just that's a perfect example of how corporations, have run amok.
You said a couple statements there that could have come right out of my fifth book. I mean, it's interesting.
Is that right?
Because, yeah, and let me talk about the power elite for a second, just to sort of orient you with that. And there are various ways to measure who's in the power elite, but basically, I mean, in America, you can define who the wealthy families are. The Walton family at Walmart, and it goes on and on.
Sure.
There's like the top 400 families, I think, control 60% of the net worth of the country or something, either directly or indirectly. But the point about the power elite is that very often these wealthy families own corporations. They either run them, they've created them, or they're major shareholders in those corporations, so they influence them. So there's this, you've heard of the military industrial complex. There's this wealthy corporate complex that's even more powerful, and it's more powerful than the government. And if you think about that, like you look at in America, you look at the Treasury Department. All the people in the Treasury Department are ex-lobbyists, consultants, and academics that have a particular point of view and use that influence while they're in office.
Right.
And the power elite basically only wants two things in their life. They want to increase their wealth, and they want stability. So they don't like things that could negatively impact their wealth. So they actively work to prevent those things from happening. And sometimes they make mistakes and these problems happen, but the general idea is don't make waves or prevent waves from being created.
So, yeah, and I would like to touch on that and see what you think. You say that they want stability, meaning a steady cash flow and income and minimal disruptions. However, I see a major push for destabilization and fragmentation and the usage of the old military divide and conquer. When we see increased division of people, like, it's not enough to be gay or lesbian anymore. It's like it became LGBT and then LGBTQ, and now amongst them there's conservatives and liberals, and then it just continues to fractionalize and divide more and more. And it seems like we're becoming increasingly unstable. So when you say they want stability, do you think they're, or is it the same forces or maybe opposing forces at work here? But do you think it's possible that these elites want to create an instability so that they can also then come in with a stable solution? In my thinking, I think this is like a one world government.
They want stability so they keep control, and they
protect
their assets. And let me elaborate on your question, because it's a very good question. So what is going on in American society is separate from the power structure of the country, in that this tribal state exists, and the power elite probably doesn't mind the instability because that makes government fossilized, right? So when the left and right are fighting, or Congress is equally divided, and the ideology is controlling both sides, then you're never going to make any progress. And so what I write in my books is, you got to solve tribalism before you fix the country, because
Right.
obviously the government's broken, but you can't unbreak it with two divided parts of the public. They have to solve the tribalism thing first. Now, the
Right.
tribalism, and I won't say much about the right, because the right is, I mean, what's notable about the right is they have no ideology, basically. The people on the right aspire to the status quo and they honor traditions. So their role in human society is to keep a brake on the left, who always wants to change stuff. So
Right.
this is try to create a balance between the two. The left has two factions. It has a socialist faction who's trying to create a socialist state here. And then it has an identity politics faction, sort of the quote unquote woke people, who
Right.
break society down into all these little parts you mentioned. And their ideology is to address the needs of those groups individually. What's unfortunate about that approach is that when you break people down small enough groups, you don't have any power, because the groups get small enough, they have no leverage or impact. And then the socialists would say, I just read a book by a communist about this whole thing, and I'll be happy to give you the title if you're interested. But
Oh, yeah, definitely.
the book is called How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement.
Huh.
And the author is Frederick DeBoer, Fredrik Deboer. And so, but basically his argument is that the identity politics people should join forces with the socialists, because economics is the way to get power. I mean, if you look at the socialist ideology, it's the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat needs to be big enough to apply leverage, and if it isn't, it won't make any progress. And so socialism has always been weak in the United States because it never got popular enough to have any power, and it doesn't have enough people that want to be a part of it. There's a lot of people on the left that don't like socialism, and like they're New Deal Democrats, for example. So they don't want that. So the left has a big tent with many different groups. The identity politics people are there too. And
Yep.
this goes to my fourth book, because we're seeing more and more of this because the left controls all the media.
Yeah.
Concepts like LGBTQ come out of academia as theoretical ideologies, but then they never get evaluated, because there's nobody in the right that's in academia. So they don't, because in the old days, you'd fight over concepts until a consensus was reached, and then it could go public. Now they just go public, and the media grab it and
Right.
and propagandize it.
Yeah, it's like the court of public opinion, and they have the loudest megaphone, or at least all the major established networks. A lot of us on the liberty side will refer to them as dinosaur media, the MSM. I think they're also becoming increasingly irrelevant, and I think part of the failure, the increase of fake news, just blatant lies and pushing of single narratives. I think behind it is the desperation, because they're losing eyeballs, losing audience, and therefore losing revenue, advertising revenue. So they're going to sell out to the highest bidder. We saw this with COVID-19. I don't know how many. I've seen so many compilations of news programs and things like, brought to you by Pfizer. I mean, they've put millions of dollars into their advertising, and they basically own the media. So, I mean, that's going to definitely direct the direction of the narrative of the media. It's going to be completely pro-pharmaceutical. You can't say anything contrary, or against your sponsor that's going to affect them negatively. So they're going to be very beholden to those corporate interests that have the most money.
Yeah,
but also
there's 7 major media companies in the mainstream media 7 corporations, and they're all kind of owned by the same people. They're part of the power
Absolutely.
elite.
Yes.
So the
Yep.
power and the power elite actually has an organization that handles all of its research. It's like a big think tank, but the research the ideas for the research come from the wealthy families and the corporate executives. And then they do research, and then that research is publicized. But there are separate goals for the research, one of which is convince the American people that everything is fine. So there's,
Right.
you see all kinds of advertisements about, people are happy and the economy isn't bad, and all those things. That's propaganda. And
Oh,
then there's
absolutely. Yeah.
and then there's propaganda about products and how well they work and all that. So this comes out of the think tank that's controlled by the power elites. Now,
Yeah.
let me say one more thing about the power elites that I didn't say before. These people are very well connected with each other. And the number
Mhm.
one way you can tell if somebody's in the power elite is if they went to prep school. That's the number one correlative
Is that
factor.
right?
Because they go to prep school, then they go to Harvard or Yale, they go to, Ivy League school, and then they get a consulting job, whatever. That's the power elites. But they have more loyalty to the other power elites than anybody else, than to the government or to the people, because
Absolutely.
because
Yeah.
the other power elites are just like them. They go on
Right.
vacation together, they buy mansions together, they go out to eat together, they play golf together. So their loyalty is there. Now, what makes that interesting is there's both Republicans and Democrats in the power elite.
Right.
But
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
but
Yeah.
but
The
their
Bushes and
party
the Clintons, for
affiliation is
example.
trumped by their affiliation as power elites. And they kind
Absolutely.
of
They
don't.
have no sense of national sovereignty, no loyalties, no patriotism whatsoever. I mean, we've seen this for a very long time, going back to probably the Civil War. I can't remember which armament manufacturer it was. It might have been Remington, one of the early ones, but they were selling ammunition to both sides, and that's been
Yeah.
going on for a very long time. They're more loyal to their corporate interests and the families, as you say, then they don't care at all about national interests.
And then you might be wondering, well, how long have power elites been around? It's my assertion that all the way back to the beginning of agriculture, when man first acquired property and was able to own property, that gave him power over other men. So ever since then, all human society has had a power elite operating in it, because those are the people. I mean, you just look at history, look at the Greeks or the Romans, look at the Romans, the patricians, the original 3 tribes of Rome. They had all the money, and so they had all the power.
Right.
And so
Right.
it's like a human society condition. Once you get a group of humans together that's large enough to make a society, it requires a government, and that government is going to be controlled by wealthy people.
And the wealthy elites, we were living until not that long ago in human history, maybe what 300 years ago, in predominantly around the world, the societal structure was around serfdom,
Yeah.
kingdoms and serfs.
Yeah.
And once the introduction of free trade came along, and capitalism occurred, where somebody could invest some money or time into the production of something, and had enough to share with others, and they could start trading amongst themselves, then they became less dependent on the kingdoms. And um, you know eventually we had the Magna Carta, and then led to the Constitution of the United States, and freedom unheard of in world history. And just for the last couple hundred years, we've
Well,
had undreamt of wealth
yeah,
based on.
the key there was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was 1650 to 1800. And what
Uh-huh.
that did is, for the first time, Western society recognized the value of the individual over the group, because
Right.
individuals never had rights before. So once
Right.
people got rights and there were constitutions, there could be voting. And that's when political parties appeared because they didn't exist before that. They had no,
Right.
since the people had no representation, there was nobody to vote for. And,
Right.
the nobility represented the king, basically.
Yeah. And I've been reading a little bit of von Mises recently too, and he's talking about how around this time of the Enlightenment, the power elites began to lose control, and then the prices of production and wages started to increase, and they didn't like that very much. It started cutting into their profits and their wealth, and they've resented it ever since. And I feel like there's been a long-term plan to pull us back into like a neo-feudalism now and put us back under the control of the power elites. And I hope and pray that that genie cannot be put back in the bottle, but that seems like what's really being pushed.
Yeah, well, I really worry about we talked about globalism. I worry about the direction Europe's going in because, I mean, and the WHO, which is about 75% supported by Bill Gates. And so
Yeah,
he's
yeah. How
exerting
about that? I don't think
tremendous,
a lot of people realize.
right. But I mean, they come out with stuff like the next pandemic will be ready because we're going to have digital IDs for everybody and we're going to make sure everybody gets vaccinated because we'll be able to control it. So
Right.
people who don't get the vaccine will be isolated. So I mean, there's this master like Nazi plan. I mean, this
Yeah.
you could read it right in Mein Kampf what these people are intending to do, and the same thing around the climate. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
it's just
Oh,
crazy.
it is. And it's crazy. And I think there's so many vectors we're being hit by, but the climate agenda is one of those big ones that they use to control. I remember, I'm old enough to remember as a kid that we were being told we need to worry about global cooling, and the planet is getting so cold, that they may not be able to grow crops, by the time you're an adult, and we're going to enter a new ice age. And then that, of course, that never happened. And
Yeah,
then it started becoming, global warming,
yeah,
through the, I guess, 80s and 90s. And then that fraud was exposed, and now it's climate
yeah,
change. It just, any change is bad.
right.
It's incredible. But with regard to Bill Gates buying up all the land, they want to control all of the production of crops and be able to use GMOs because they're more profitable, higher yields, lower nutritive value, of course, along with everything else, and then be able to. Oh, and then they've got these Terminator seeds, so you have to continually buy more seeds. So again, no end to their profit streams. But with regard to cattle and using climate change as an excuse for reducing the number of cattle, their methane production or whatever. I think behind that there may be, some people might think this is a stretch, but I don't think too much. Uh, Beef consumption is good for the human mind. There have been anthropologists who said that the consumption of meat is what led to the development of such large brains.
Yeah, I've read
And
that.
yeah, and you're talking about some of the genetic differences between the left and the right, and just in people in general. I think that loss of consumption of meat can lead to eventually lower IQ scores and things like that, and
Yeah, I mean,
too much.
I read a lot of anthropology. My theory is if you look at what human beings have eaten through most of their history, that'd be a good thing to eat because
Right,
that's our bodies developed to eat, and meat is part of that.
right. Well,
So
we got here doing some things right,
yeah,
and reached the peak of civilization somehow. I think
they
that's
didn't
one of
have
those
any
things.
bread, so they didn't eat any carbohydrates, so they didn't get fat because
Right.
carbohydrates are bad for you. So
Yeah, very interesting. Going back a little bit to you're talking about the genetics of the left-right paradigm. Um, it is interesting. I do think that there is a world. I think it might be nurture and nature. I think there may be some genetic or physiological differences if on the whole. I mean, of course, there's always exceptions, and it's hard to quantify, but there are just some interesting things I've noticed over the years. One study that stood out in mind was somebody was looking at physiological differences between politically left and politically right men. They just wanted to do like an objective study. One of the things that they noticed in physiological measurements was bicep size tended to be larger in right politically minded men and smaller in the left.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gotten me thinking, is there anything to that at all? And I think sort of as an extension of that, if you feel that you're less in control or not as strong, you would be the kind of person who's more dependent on a parental figure or the state or welfare, or be in favor of those kinds of things more than somebody who's more physically capable and confident and able to fend for themselves, and more independent minded. And I think there's something there. And I'm not, of course, I'll be accused of all kinds of ridiculous conspiracy theories, when you talk about that. But I think there is something to that in that sort of mindset.
Let me talk about their origin, because the origin has been described. Obviously, the left and right are behavioral differences, and they developed, perhaps a million years ago, when man left Africa only 60 or 70,000 years ago. It wasn't a million years ago, but these behavioral tendencies were developed before that. But basically, the story is when man encountered heterogeneous environments, he had to have ways to adapt to different environments. Because if you had a certain way of living and you got in the wrong ecosystem, you wouldn't survive. So what developed is these two personality types. One likes change and one doesn't like change. So the ones that like change were willing to go find food, and the other side wanted to manage food. They're more conscientious and better managers. The others were more adventurous, open-minded, and etc. So both those groups work in human groups at that time were 50 to 150 people. They were egalitarian societies, and they could make decisions even though they were different points of view by consensus, because there was no government. Like the chief of the tribe decided, or they voted, or something like that. But if you take an example where you've only got left people, they would all be killed because they would do too much hunting and would all be killed. If you had right people, they wouldn't do enough hunting and they'd probably starve. So it kind of points to the fact that there's a balance, there's a behavioral balance there, and the genetic portion of that is perhaps 1/2, 0.5 or something, and the rest is behavioral, because there's so many things that are being discovered that are that way. That genetics mean a lot, but they don't mean everything. It's not a
right. I do think environment plays a role. On that line of thinking, have you read Guns, Germs, and Steel?
No, I've read a lot about it, but I've never read it because I think I disagree with the author's philosophy. But I should read it.
Yeah, and I
that's just a not qualified opinion on my part.
Yeah, well, I do question. I mean, I question everything, but since having read it, and the more I learn, I do question his premise, but he also makes some very compelling arguments in favor of environmental influences over the development of technology. And one of the things that he argues is that in the Americas, with the the native, the Aztecs and other tribes living like in the Andes and stuff. They had very structured, organized societies, but they didn't have the opportunity to develop the technology and spread it, um, because the Americas are oriented in a north-south orientation, on the globe, and climates, environments change, from north to south, but not from east to west. So you have
Right.
more opportunity to spread invention, innovation, and grow as a society and population in an east-west sort of orientation, because you have stability of crops and homogeneous society and homogeneous food production. And so Europe was more geared, the layout of the land masses are more east-west, and so you
Yeah.
could have that more explosive growth of population, and thus more innovation and technology and those kinds of things.
No, I
Was
agree
one of
with
the sort of,
I agree with
yeah, it
that.
was
I mean,
it was interesting.
there were, I guess, five principal ancient societies that all started about the same time. Mesoamerica, which is Middle America, the
Yep.
Incas,
Yep.
Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. And so they all developed because the circumstances were right for them to be able to grow crops. And
Right.
people didn't know how to farm then. So, like in the case of Mesopotamia, they settled around the Tigris and Euphrates River because there was an alluvial plain there, and floods would come in and then go out, and so the soil was always hydrated, and so they could take a stick and make a groove in the mud and plant seeds there, and you don't have to have a plow, you don't have to have anything, and that's kind of how agriculture got started. But they
Right.
were, Mesopotamia is kind of in the middle of everything, and so it was taken over by people coming from the west and the east and all that.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and so interesting how we've gotten to where we are today. It almost seems like we're regressing in some ways rather than progressing with the worldwide chaos. I have felt for some time now that we are entering a global historic change, like a paradigm change, or like maybe the end of history. I don't know what. There's a lot of names for it. What do you agree that we're entering some kind of change unlike any other we've seen in history? And B, what would you call it?
Um, I agree that that's happening. It's very hard to get a feel for what it will be, and what's happening to me is that capitalism is failing, not because it alleviates poverty and starvation. I mean, it's well documented the good things about it, but
Yep.
the way power is wielded in Western societies is not satisfying the public. They become more isolated from the public, and so the people are unhappy. I mean, that's why there are these
Right.
right leaning leaders, being elected around Western Europe, and of course Trump is an example of that. Populism occurs when people decide that neither party is effective. So they look to
Right.
somebody else that's on in the outside who isn't, and in his case, he can't be bought. So he's even more attractive because everybody else is bought. And so,
Right.
and the same with the third parties with, RFK Jr. running. Third parties and populists evolve because of dissatisfaction with government. And our government
Yeah.
is completely ineffective, partly because of tribalism. But I mean, it's also, lobbyists have the power. They dictate to the representatives how they're going to vote, what the issues they're going to vote on, and how they're going to vote because they're financing their campaigns. The public
Yeah.
is.
I guess if I had any complaints about capitalism, and I'm still a diehard free market capitalist because it's maybe the best house in a bad neighborhood. to quote Alex Jones, but I think it's the best system that we've had for governance ever. But I think a fault is its corruptibility, or its capability of being compromised, as we see it has been. But as an ideal, as a way of running a society, I think it's the best thing that we've been able to come up with. I'm certainly not going to turn towards Marxist thinking or socialism or communism as a solution.
Right. And this, it's funny, I quote it in my new book, I quote Winston Churchill. He's the one that said, it's the worst kind of political system ever devised, but it's better than all the other ones, which is
Exactly.
I don't know if you heard that, but
yeah, no, I absolutely.
but
Yep.
the point, and I make this point in my new book, the point I'm trying to get to is that never have democracies been challenged the way they are now, and never
Yeah.
have they become as ineffective and isolated from the people as they are now. And
Right.
no point in history has this crisis existed, because there weren't, before the democracies, there were monarchies and dictators, and this type of system didn't exist. There
Right.
were no freedoms and all that. So when you break down a democracy, what happens? The one sentence answer to why do governments collapse is when they fail to govern. But
Right.
what happens when in a modern democracy or postmodern democracy when the government fails to govern? It breaks down, but what does it break down into? I mean, you can't assume that they'll become socialists because, and there's a whole story about that that I've written about. Socialism has been ineffective every time it's been tried. And the few times
Right.
it's been
It's
effective,
yep.
like Cuba and North Korea and stuff, every time it's been effective, it transitioned to totalitarianism in the middle of the takeover, because totalitarians don't have any concerns about violence. And so they use
Right.
violence to take over, where socialists are a little too nice and they just hope that they're going to convince a majority of people to go their way, and there's never a majority. So
Right. I've thought about these sort of different systems of governance, from capitalism and democracy to socialism to communism to outright totalitarianism. And I think one of the biggest factors as to whether it's successful, or I should say least damaging to the individuals in that society is a question of scale. Using the example of the smallest social unit, the family, that's basically a dictatorship,
yeah,
or it should be, right?
yeah. Or
Because
an
you can't have,
aristocracy between the parents, I guess.
yeah, right. And then you can within your neighborhood have or up to groups of maybe 300 people, like kibbutzes would be an example, where you can have somewhat of a, not a dictatorship, but more of a democracy or a democratic dictatorship, where everybody knows each other.
Yeah.
There can be, you can have I guess it would be like an ideal scenario
Utopian
for
society.
socialism or communism, like a commune,
Yeah.
when everybody knows each other and there's
Yep.
accountability. But once you scale that up to larger and larger groups where you don't know each other, then there can be no trust or social contract, or it's too easy to break that trust. That might, the idealists who love the idea of communism, that's fine if you want to have a group of 200 or 300 people and you're all on the same page. But
Right.
when you try to apply that to a nation like the former Soviet Union, where you're spanning 11 time zones of human beings, and you've got within every time zone a different dialect, different ways of doing things, different businesses, different politics. You can't govern from a centralized communist system that way. And it, as you say, it just fell apart like every other time.
Right.
So yeah, I do think it's kind of a
Well, what you're getting
question of
to
scale.
is, I've written about, which is basically political morality. And people have their own personal morality, which dictates obviously the way they behave and how they live.
Right.
When the organization of people in the society gets big enough, the personal morality is replaced by a public morality, which is basically the laws and the operation of the government. So, as an individual, you may disagree with the public morality, but you choose to live in that society because enough of it is satisfying to you that you want to stay there. But
Right. I think in today's climate, though, we have I think the majority of the people are completely disgusted with our current political climate and the way they have tried to seize power. I mean, it's become like a self-sustain, like an organism that has its own sense of self-preservation, and it's growing. I would like a cancer, and it's going to kill the rest of us if we allow it to continue to grow as it is. And I think in the case of Trump, politically, like he probably wouldn't be a viable candidate if things were stable and everybody was happy. I think he's more of a symptom or a
yeah,
response
exactly. Yep.
than it takes such an extreme personality to stand up. I mean, it's almost like the time for diplomacy and calm discussion is kind of gone,
Yeah.
and it takes like an extreme, like, hey, we're just gonna do things in the national interest this way, because that's, I think it's what the majority of the people want, or they're at least disgusted
Well,
with
there's a
the
lot of people attracted to him, and obviously he has a ton of shortcomings, but a lot of people attracted to him because people like a strong leader, and they want
right.
somebody that'll do something versus the current crew who don't do anything. I mean, it reminds
Right.
me of that, and I don't know if you've ever heard this. If you do a poll in Russia, and at any time, this decade, the prior decade, whenever, you say who's the greatest leader Russia's ever had, it's very high percentage Stalin. The
Yeah.
trains ran on time. And people can, if people can exist in a society and they feel somewhat satisfied the way the society operates, they're not going to complain about it. I mean, and
Right.
there were a lot of shortcomings to the communist system. I'm just saying that if something is corrupt and you know it and you can live with it, you can get by.
Right. I don't think it's ever satisfied, though. The corruption and the power always seeks more, what is the quote? Absolute power corrupts
Yep.
absolutely, or
Yep. Exactly. Yep.
yeah. A couple things while we have some time left before we go too long. I wanted to touch on the red blue paradigm. It's now like sort of a us versus them sports team mentality, and the whole red right and blue left. I don't remember colors, like team colors, being associated with Republicans and Democrats as a kid, and I don't know when that shift happened. But have you noticed that?
Yeah.
And when did it
I think
occur?
it's only 10 or 20 years ago because I mean, it was
Yeah,
always the elephant and the donkey were the two
right,
symbols, but they weren't colors. They were
right.
just, yeah.
I just noticed, like, one year I was looking at like the polls, on election night, and they were like red team, blue team, and I'm like, when did that happen? It just sort of snuck in, and I just suddenly became aware of it. But it was, yeah, but it's a very polarizing thing, and it, I think, also points towards your whole idea of like tribalism. You say that America is becoming, or is now, tribal. How did that happen, and when did it happen, and why?
That's a good question. Multiple answers. I'll start by talking about Congress lost its middle in the 90s. There used to be moderates who mediated discussions and debates between the right and left and got people to compromise. And they're all
Yeah, I don't hear
gone.
the term moderates anymore,
They're gone.
now that you mention it.
Yeah, they're only ideologues in Congress, which makes it harder to get consensus because there isn't anybody that's willing to work with the other side. But
Right.
the fact that Congress is that way is not Congress's makeup and behavior is not influence the American people. The American people's behavior influences the Congress because the government only does what they perceive the people expect. So, the tribalism started, and I think the simple explanation is the left wants change quickly, more quickly than the right wants change. And so
Uh-huh.
the battle and the right is very reactionary because it thinks the left is going too fast. So
Right.
they formed their own tribe in relation to the left tribe, to fight back because of things like, I mean, the left tends to discard religion. They say people are religious or stupid because they believe something that isn't true. So if
Right.
you're on the right and you're an evangelical, you're not going to like hearing that. You're not going to support somebody that would say that. So,
Right.
and in my tribalism book, I've got a chart that shows like these people are all on the right and these people are on the, like farmers are on the right and small business owners are on the right and abortionists, pro-abortion people are on the left. And I mean, you could just make a big diagram of all the groups and it's basically ideology. And the other thing is everything in the country became political, which contributes to tribalism, and it's helped along by social media because
Oh yeah.
social media has no filter, and it's the first time in human history that crazy people have had a global forum.
Right.
25 years ago, if you wanted to have explain some crackpot theory, you had to go to a park and get on a soapbox and talk because
Right.
you couldn't get into the media. You're not going to be interviewed by NBC News. But
Right.
now on social media, you can say anything you want. You can make yourself an influencer. You can get rich by saying controversial things that get a lot of eyeballs. I mean, it's a horrible development, basically, because there is
Yeah.
no control.
I have mixed feelings about that because obviously, we don't like the things that we disagree with when they confront our personal identity. And that's, I think, the danger of identity politics. You shouldn't attach your personal self to a political party or any kind of affiliation, because then you can't argue with it because it becomes a personal attack on you.
Yeah.
And you get a visceral personal reaction from that. But um, I also think that we need to respect freedom of speech. And as you say, though, that platform for freedom of speech has become much larger, and we are in a different era now with the advent of this interconnectedness and global communication. But I still think that it's important that uh, I'm not a fan of censorship, even though I may disagree, violently with a lot of what's being put out there. But it still seems to me, though, that censorship is occurring, and it seems to favor the left narrative. The big tech companies are, part of that mainstream media, and you do see them pushing and influencing towards whatever their agenda is. And again, probably very often highly influenced by the power elite at the root of it.
Yeah, and
But
it's interesting the way the Silicon Valley has influenced the power elite because the power elite historically has been conservatives because that was where the wealth was. But
hmm,
Silicon Valley has produced so much wealth, they've created a great deal of influence and they're heavily involved in the power elite, both from the standpoint of being rich members of it, but because they control technology, and technology is essential to the power elite because it's the media and computational devices and all that kind of stuff, phones and all that. So they
well,
have
it's a tool of
enormous power.
control.
Yeah, they have
Yeah,
enormous control.
absolutely. Moving to your blog, you recently posted a blog titled Aldous Huxley Revisited,
Yep.
talking about the importance of his writing. Was that an allusion to his own book, Brave
Brave
New
New
World
World.
Revisited?
Brave New. Oh, yeah. Yes, I did. That was a parody.
There's an
Not
allusion to
parody,
that.
but allude.
Yeah,
Yes.
I I've been meaning to read that second book of his. I did read Brave New World, and I've also read 1984, and they seem to be two not slightly, but very different dystopian futures. I think that who's the author of 1984? Uh,
George Orwell.
George Orwell. Thank you. I think that he was trying to warn society through his writing. Aldous Huxley, I'm not sure if he, with his ties to the elites, was he advocating for his dystopian future, or was he warning?
He was
Or
warning.
what are your thoughts on that? He was
He was
warning.
warning. And the Brave New World Revisit. It's funny you talked about those because I read 1984 Brave New World and revisited all within the last 6 months because I wanted
Interesting.
to. And then I wrote about Orwell also. I published an article in Quillette about Orwell, but very interesting. I mean, Orwell's 1984 is scary because I
Yes,
mean,
it
it's
is.
right in your face. Whereas Brave
Yeah.
New World is a little more abstract because the society is, you know, in a steady state. And I mean, they've solved all the problems of getting people to behave. And I mean, it's like a sanitized
Right.
society, even though it's evil. Um,
Right.
and so, but Brave New World Revisited is very interesting. It's a novel, actually, but it reverses a lot of what's in Brave New World. Like instead of using
Interesting.
drugs to make people behave, in Revisited, they use drugs to achieve euphoria. So they have
Huh.
like a pleasurable versus a controlling function.
Interesting. I did a podcast episode a while back titled Brave New World versus 1984. Do you see society heading towards one or the other right now, and why? Or do you see them both coming to play?
Well, you got, I mean, I think you got to solve the problem of what happens to democracy to answer that because they're both totalitarian worlds. So you know, if you imagine that some Western societies could become totalitarian, then you would have that in the extreme. But it's not that easy to go totalitarian. I mean, the circumstances that Hitler operated under were quite unique. And I'm sure you've read about that. I mean, the
Yeah.
economic situation of Germany
Right.
and a very strong communist party there, socialist party. And basically, the Germans voted for Hitler to avoid voting for the socialists. I mean, they picked what they thought was a lesser of two evils, and
Right.
that turned out to be a big mistake. But you've got to have, there's kind of a rule book for how you've got to take over a political system. And one of the most important is you got to have the military. And so, like in
Right.
America, the military is, I don't know, emasculated, if you want to use that word, in
Oh,
relation to its
absolutely. You can
power.
use that word. It's yeah, pretty evident if you look at there was some Air Force, some very woke Air Force recruitment ads that came out a few years ago that definitely attest to that.
But I mean, even the fact that it's the military is controlled by the civilian government is a key important factor in keeping the society under control because it lowers the opportunity that, like, if you had a general who was, I, I don't know, president or something, you got a big problem because then he could
Right.
just take his own military and create havoc. So,
Right.
I mean, if you're going to change a society and we're imagining that somehow a one of the current democracies gets overthrown, you got to have a military and you've got to have a influential, well, you have to have a part of society that is organized and desiring change. And
Right.
do you know who Hannah Arendt is? She
I
was a philosopher and a psychiatrist, and she wrote between the 20s and 40s, but she wrote a great book on
hmm,
totalitarianism, which you should read if you're interested, because she
okay.
describes exactly how you get there. And
Okay.
Hitler used
Interesting.
that. I mean, you have to start with the largest block of people in society that have the same opinions, which are basic workers who are not educated and can be influenced. So you build off that, and then you add useful idiots to it because there's another large group of the public who want to be part of a winning team and are heavily influenced by, propaganda and all that. And you put those two together, and then she suggests you have to have a scapegoat, which in Hitler's case was the Jews, because
Right.
you have to incite part of the revolutionary organization to want to overcome some entity that is evil and represented as evil as the Jews were, and that's an additional motivation. Then you stir all
Right.
that up with violence, and you're done. You got a totalitarian government. And so, if
Right.
any of those components are missing, you're not going to get there. Um,
Yeah, I really wonder. I see a number of potential scapegoats. I mean, well, Biden keeps throwing out the massive threat of white supremacy, which, I never heard so much
it
about that
it
since
doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There are white supremacists certainly, but
oh yeah,
the average conservative is not a white supremacist. Most people who are
absolutely not.
most people who are educated understand that you get the value out of people that you interact with based on their mind, not the way they look. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
the left has flipped Martin Luther King, who wanted to don't judge me by my color, and now everybody's judged by their color. So if
I
you're
know
what
that they've undone all the work that Martin Luther King
did,
did. And it used to be like the Democrats and the neoliberals that were so in favor of him. And now it's flipped around. And it's like the left has become fascist and communist. It's weird,
yeah,
like just the inversion that has happened. I really encourage people to please read. I think a lot of our it has contributed to the downfall of society, in my opinion, that people read less and less. They're just consuming mindless dribble on social media and television and other media, and not putting forth the actual effort to read things that matter.
yeah. That's one of the
And
worst things about tribalism is for the simple-minded. If you, it's very nice to be in a tribe because you don't have to think. Somebody did all the thinking for you. All you have to do is,
right,
I'm in the blue tribe and hell with everybody else. And then
right,
so you get into like this, you know, mind spiral thing where you become less engaged than you were before you got in a tribe.
right. Well, sometimes, folks, thinking hurts a little bit. It strains you, but it's like,
Yeah.
exercising any other kind of thing that requires some effort. But I think it's well worth it. Just I keep telling people, read, damn it. If you want to argue with me, I'm more conservative, and classically liberal though, and very tolerant. But when I get arguments from the left about things, I'm like, have you actually read anything about that? Have you read any actual history?
Right.
And usually it's no
No.
clue. Can't be bothered to think or ask questions.
I
That's
don't know if you're
frustrating.
aware of this, but there are organizations that have been uh, put together to fight against tribalism. And I want to mention one because I belong to
Okay.
it. It's called Braver Angels.
Ah, okay.
And I joined in at the end of last year, and I'm going to go to they're having a convention in June this year. But basically, Braver Angels is a number of local groups because it's organized by city who put left and rights together to debate issues to reach a consensus. So the
Oh
rules
wow.
about, and the meetings are usually split offs into pairs, a red and a blue, and they pick issues to debate, and they agree to not use, raise their voice. Politeness
I
has to
was
be
just gonna say,
the rule.
how is there not screaming?
It's amazing. Well, one of the things I've discovered since I'm in it is the people that joined it are not the people that need to join it, because the
Right.
people that
Yeah. Yeah.
join
Yeah.
it are open to consensus.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. Yeah. What is the best website for folks to go to, or the best URL for you?
It's just MikeAnderson'sBooks.com. And
Okay.
Anderson has an S and Books has an S. So it's Mike
Okay.
Anderson Books. And my Substack is Mike A. let's see, Mike0418.substack.com.
Awesome. Cool. I've got so many more questions for you, Mike. We might need to do another episode in the not too distant future. I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you again, Mike, for being on the show. And folks, until next time, just please be good.